And there we are. And good morning. Welcome, Mickey and Karen here reading to us from Forgiveness in Jesus. Let me make sure that this doesn't start speaking loudly for me. All right. And so, good morning, Mickey. Good morning, Karen. How are you all this morning?
Good
Good.
morning. Doing well.
Yeah, I'm good. I'm good. Thank you, Lynn. Yeah.
All right. So, we are going to get our book up. And Forgiveness in Jesus, which I'm really excited. I'm glad you're reading this book. A lot of people have been very complimentary of this book, so that's always so helpful, and a lot of people have gotten a lot of help from it. So I'm going to turn this mic over to you to pray in and get going.
Good morning, Karen. Would you like to pray us in?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our reading of Forgiveness in Jesus, the meeting place of A Course in Miracles and Christianity by Kenneth Wapnick, PhD. Let's all just sit back and relax and take a breath, quiet the mind, bring in the Holy Spirit, and remember that I am here only to be truly helpful. I am here to represent Him who sent me. I do not have to worry about what to say or what to do because He who helps me will direct me. I am content to be wherever He wishes, knowing He goes there with me. I will be healed as I let Him teach me to heal. Amen.
Amen. So I have us, Karen and Lynn, on in my book, because I have the fourth edition, I have us at chapter 1, The Dynamics of the Ego, the World of Guilt, 2 Levels. And Karen, did you want me to read, or would you like to start the reading off? What would you like?
Are we starting at the Principles of the Course in Miracles, Part 1? Let me see.
We're
Let
at
me see.
chapter 1, The Dynamics of the
The
Ego.
dynamics of the ego. Yes, I'm sorry. I was looking at the wrong page. All right.
And is it showing on the screen?
It is.
Okay, good. Yeah.
Okay. So we actually read the Part 1 Principles, Course in Miracles last week.
Yeah, we finished.
Because I know we finished the introduction.
Yeah.
And we did finish the principles.
Yes.
Okay.
I believe so. I believe so. Does your book, after the introduction, does it go into principles, or does it go straight to chapter 1? What does your book do,
I
Karen?
have after the introduction, there is the Principles of A Course in Miracles, Part 1.
I don't have that. Mine, just because I have volume 4, mine just goes to chapter 1, which Lynn has on here. So
Okay, just one second. Mickey, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, I also have a second introduction that says, at first glance, psychology and spirituality would seem to make unlikely bedfellows.
Yeah, that's the Principles of A Course in Miracles. I think it's actually pretty important.
okay, actually,
Introduction.
I do have that one. I didn't know that was the principles. So I don't know. Lynn, does the Kindle have that?
I don't know. This is where we ended up last week. So, excuse me. You read up until this page, and then this is where we ended, and this is where I marked.
Yeah, that's where I marked too. Was where
So
it
I
said,
don't have, but let's look and see if there's a
It's called, this book has it as part one, Principles of A Course in Miracles.
Okay, I don't see that in the table of contents.
Lynn, maybe if you go to the search magnifying glass and type in at first glance psychology and spirituality, and
Okay,
it
because
might be called something else.
because I'm looking through the yeah, we already read part one, Principles of A Course in Miracles. We read
Uh,
that part.
does anybody remember reading that last week?
No, Karen, we have, I think, older versions of this,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe they split it up into. That's why I wanted Lynn to search for that because maybe we read it.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure we read it because otherwise I wouldn't have.
Right.
I had it marked last
Yeah.
time.
Yeah, but
And
yours is different. Your version is different, and I'm wondering if they combined this part into the other
no,
part.
here it is. It's right here. It's where we
Yeah, there
already
it
read.
is.
Yeah, we
Oh,
read that
okay.
already.
We
We read,
did.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
yeah.
Never mind then.
Okay,
So
I'm
yeah,
sorry.
we
I
read all that.
honestly, I do not
Do
remember
you want to
reading
go
that.
back and read it again?
Oh, it doesn't matter. I just don't remember reading it. That's all. It's fine. Whatever you guys want to do is fine. It's
Let,
funny.
let's
I just don't remember it.
let's start it on chapter one. I think that would be best because we already read the principles. We finished the introduction last week, so yeah. So I think, but it's up to you. So I'm just one person.
We have plenty of time to read whatever y'all want to read. So if you want to go back and read that again, that would be fine by me. Of course, I don't care. Do you want to do that?
I think Karen does. So and
Okay.
maybe, so yeah, maybe it would be good. It's not long. Karen, do you want me to read it or would you like to read it? What would you like?
I think I'll read this
Okay.
introduction.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll have to check too because I swear I do not remember reading this,
That's fine.
and I just don't.
Everything's perfect, right?
So crazy. But I'm known to forget things. So, okay. Part one, Principles of A Course in Miracles, Introduction. At first glance, psychology and spirituality would seem to make unlikely bedfellows. For the first 50 years of this century, since the time of Freud's first published writings, psychology and religion have not been very friendly enemies. Religion, and rightly so, was suspicious of psychology's strong tendency to reduce all human behavior and experience to unconscious sexual forces, in parentheses, psychoanalysis, or to dismiss any experience as fundamentally irrelevant if it did not obey certain empirically validated laws and could not itself be observed and measured, in parentheses, behaviorism. Religionists often were very quick to dismiss a psychology that reflected the values of a materialistic and secular culture, seeing it as the work of the devil and designed to explain away their faith or even destroy it. Now, I'm just going to stop here for a minute. And I kind of am starting to remember a little bit, but what I noticed when I reread this section is there's so much in it that is interesting that I didn't notice before. So I think that may be what it is. Just looking at Freud's psychology of the unconscious sexual forces. He doesn't mention this, but I remember learning this in psychology in high school about the Oedipus complex, where a boy develops that unconscious infatuation towards his mother and then wants to kill his father. And then the same thing with the daughter, she has this, unconscious infatuation with her father and wants to kill her mother. So it's like it stems from the Oedipus, who was the Greek figure who killed his father and married his mother. So I just thought that was interesting, and I know for me, it made me think about psychologically how I ended up choosing men just like my father in my relationships and thinking I could change them because, my father was an alcoholic. So the psychology of it really, throughout this whole introduction, um, I think it really just interested me. And that's just the first thing that came up for me. Does anybody have anything they'd like to share on that?
Yeah, I do, Karen, if that's okay. Uh, yeah, I thought it was really interesting too, and it's good we're going back over this again. And you mentioned the Oedipus complex that you learned in school, and my mom was born in Germany, East Poland, and my brother ended up marrying a gal from Germany, and so I do see, uh, he kind of married somebody like his mom, and so I think there's a lot of truth to that, and so I like that you brought that up, and also how Ken wrote here about his first published writings were psychology and religion, and that have not been very friendly enemies. Uh, so it's just really interesting about that, and also Ken has said that if it wasn't for Freud, A Course in Miracles probably would have never been written. So. Uh, I don't think he knew that the world was a dream, but he sure knew that the underpinnings of the mind and the unconscious. So thank you, Karen.
Yeah, he actually does say in this introduction how, there would never be a Course in Miracles without Freud. He actually mentions it later on in this too. So I always thought that was interesting as well. So anyway, I think we'll go to paragraph 2, which he talks about Maslow. This mistrustful and even hostile relationship began to shift dramatically during the 1960s from both sides. In psychology, the seeds of change that were sown in many post war writers began to bear fruit in the emergence of what Maslow termed the third force, in parentheses, to distinguish it from psychoanalysis and behaviorism. This grouping encompassed the theorists like Young, Rogers, and the existential and humanistic psychologists. The focus shifted to a more respectful view of our creative and spiritual strivings, placing greater emphasis on the present moments and evolving future as contrasted to seeing people imprisoned in the chains of their past. In fact, a fourth force has recently been described, transpersonal psychology, which seeks to explore the capital S self that is beyond our personal self through medication, biofeedback, training, drug experimentation, etc. As a result, humanistic and transpersonal psychologists have looked increasingly to spirituality as a guiding force for their for their investigations. Interestingly, to a great extent, these endeavors have focused more on the East than the West, using techniques and teachers, in parentheses, gurus, from predominantly Hindu or Buddhist orientations, not to mention secular ones, as opposed to those from our own Judeo-Christian heritage. And what came up for me now, I don't really remember. I mean, I remember Maslow and these psychiatrists when I took Introduction to Psychology. Um, I was really into child psychology at the time, but in the introduction, I do remember Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And Lynn might relate to this with her, the process that she talks about with nonviolent communication. This might have some um, correlation, I'm not sure, but it's a process, which I love about Maslow. It's this process. He uses like a pyramid, and he starts out like our basic needs are met, and then it's a process of becoming self-actualized, which is like the top of the ladder. So I like that Maslow had that hierarchy of needs that really is that process, of forgiveness in a lot of ways. We start out with the psychological, then he goes to the safety, then love, which is the belonging, and then the self-esteem, and then the self-actualization, which is a process. We don't just become, self-actualized. Just like we really don't even know, I didn't anyway, understand true forgiveness. But the existential was what I was really interested in, and this talks a little bit about it, and it places that greater emphasis on the present moment, and I think that's what the course is teaching us. So I just thought it was interesting how the psychologies that focused on that was probably part of Helen's consciousness, that really was never mentioned about the existential, which was, you know, I thought interesting because we really focused on finding the meaning and purpose of life from really recognizing that death, was to come eventually. So, we notice how important it is to recognize that, we're only here temporarily, and to be in the present moment for the reason that we never know. Even though the course doesn't believe in death, this focuses on death as, helping us find meaning in the life that we're living in the present moment. Yeah. So that's pretty much all I got out of that. Does anyone else have anything to share?
Yeah, I do, Karen. Thank you for sharing that. I love actually that we're going over this introduction and how you brought that up, and how Ken in this book in the introduction does bring up Maslow. He brings up, about that it comes that a lot of these endeavors have come from the East more than from the West. And also, he brought up Young. And I know in one of Ken's videos that I was watching, he said, a lot of good things that Young brought to to the table for us to understand. But he just said, between Young and Freud, he said Young's ego was what got in the way. His ego was so large. And here in the Hindu and Buddhist orientations, I know Lynn knows a lot about Buddhism, but Ken brings this up. So it's kind of like I love how he brought this up in an introduction. So it's kind of like when you go to college, or you have to take your prerequisites before you can get into the nursing program, you have to have prerequisites. And one of those prerequisites was, I believe it was in psychology one, or one of the psychology classes, where they taught you about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And I know in Vedanta, the highest teaching is also which comes from the East, is that the world's an illusion. And Buddha realized that the world was a dream. And so he broke away from the Hindu religion. And that's where, he realized everything was a dream, was an illusion. So I don't know if Lynn wants to say anything about that, but it's beautiful. I like how he's bringing all this in as an introduction. So it's kind of like on this book on forgiveness and Jesus, it's like we're going through on the introduction the prerequisites before we can get it, before we go a little deeper. So the way Ken teaches is really like we're in a college class. So thank you so much, Karen, for sharing that. And I don't know if Lynn wants to kind of comment on Buddhism, because I think she's studied Buddhism much more than me. So I've studied more Vedanta.
Yeah, I actually just wanted to mention that I've been listening to the on death and dying, that which I send out to, I think, everyone, the audio. And Ken actually mentions Ramakrishna, Ramana Maharshi. He acknowledges the teachers that had become realized. So he has a lot more uh, uh, education or training or understanding of the various spiritual teachings, than a lot of, any psychologist during that time, I think. So I love that. And yeah, all of it. You mentioned Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and I realized that, those are the things that Rafi talks about. Are you doing this for approval? Are you doing this for um, what are the things that you're doing it for? uh those are the needs that we work through, and as we work through to become self-actualized, we come to a place where those things uh you know fade away because they're no longer a part of our need. And I also was going to mention that coming up in the next paragraph, he's going to be talking about Vatican II, which was here. I need to fix this so that people on Pal Talk can hear me for a minute. Um, he talks about Vatican II, which was a huge shift in the Catholic Church in the 60s, where they they completely shifted everything. And that's when, if you were Catholic, they started doing the folk mass, and people became involved. They had a lot of lay people involved in different things. They changed a lot of the basic uh, beliefs or teachings of the Catholic Church to make it more modern and give it more of a, they went from doing the mass in Latin to doing it in English so people could understand it. A lot of shifts and changes went along during this time. So I really appreciate, that we're reading this as well. Anyway, I'm going to turn it back to you guys and mute my mic.
Thank you, Lynn. And yeah, I also love that about Ken, his diversity and understanding, not only the psychology of everything, and he knew all the teachings. And he used to say, of the, the Indian quote unquote gurus. And also, he would talk about the ancient Greeks and how important it is to really study them and how relevant it is and how much he brings it into like the Oedipus. I mean, he didn't Oedipus, Oedipus, he didn't mention that in here, but it was evident to me that's what he was talking about. And it all stems from that, all of this stems from that. And that's where Freud learned from as well. And I love that you mentioned Michale, I love that you mentioned the prerequisite because I was thinking on the same lines of this because, that's another thing. It is like taking a college class with Ken. And I also took that intro to psychology as a prerequisite because I was really interested in child psychology. But of course, I had to start out at the beginning in the introduction, and which was extremely interesting. And it led me to really my favorite psychology was abnormal psychology. I recognized through learning about psychology that, my most interested subject was the killer on the road. His brain is squirming like a toad. Take
That's
a long
very
holiday. I mean, seriously, I was attracted to them. I worked in a juvenile detention center in the 90s, and I was attracted to the sickest ones. They're the ones that I could help the most. And I just had this very strong connection to them. I don't know if I was a mentally ill back in my past life. I don't know what it is, but I did have a juvenile delinquent at home at the time, so that could have had something to do with it. But also, what you mentioned about Lynn about Ramana Maharshi, in the workbook, in the very last question, what am I? Ramana Maharshi's book is titled, Who Am I? So I think that that was I mean, I don't know. I'm just saying, I'm thinking maybe that was in Helen's consciousness when she wrote this, because the book, Ramana Maharshi's book, teaches how to look deeper and to find the deeper part of ourselves, that isn't affected by our changing form, how there is that deeper knowing of the truth of who we are that is changeless, so I think she got some of that from Ramana Maharshi in her consciousness, but who knows? I mean, that's just my thought. So yeah, I love the reading this again. I'm really grateful too because I didn't notice a lot of this stuff before for some reason. So yeah, thank you both. And anyone else before I go on to the next paragraph? Okay. Accompanying this notable change is the psychological attitude towards religious experience has been a similar shift on the part of religious institutions, as seen particularly in the Catholic Church since Vatican II, in the incredibly short period of time that followed the Great Council. The doors closed to change burst opened. The doors closed to change burst open. As the newer forms of psychology were gaining popularity, the church's desire to become more accessible to the secular world and receptive to the needs of the members directed to its former adversary, this was seen most especially in the area of interpersonal relationships where psychological insights and techniques were of greater value. So the only thing that comes to me was what Lynn was sharing about the Vatican II, because my uncle used to share stories with me when he was an altar boy, and he had to learn, the language, the Latin, and they did speak a lot in Latin back then, and that changed so the layperson could understand. But the Latin was, I think it was just starting to change when he was an altar boy, but they still spoke in Latin, and he had to learn it, to understand what they were saying. So I thought that was also interesting. Anyone else on this paragraph before I go to the next? Okay. Despite the rapprochement, however, the fact remains that psychology and spirituality are different. They emphasize different levels of experience because their foundations rest on mutually exclusive premises. Yet, in that difference, that psychology's value to spirituality is found. Psychology can teach us nothing about the spiritual life, but it can teach us a great deal about our personal self, what we call the quote unquote ego, which interferes with our relationship with God. It is ironic that Freud's brilliant analysis of the psyche's functioning can be used to enhance one's spiritual growth. Throughout his life, Freud relentlessly pursued the idea that all religious experience and belief were neurotic at best and psychotic at worst, being nothing but projections of repressed infantile conflicts. His own theory, however, would teach us that one never strives so hard against something unless one were correspondingly attracted to it, even if that attraction remained out of awareness. One might conclude that Freud's whole theoretical system was designed on one level to defend against the threats, quote unquote, he felt from his own powerful spirituality. Thus, he strove to believe that the material world was the only reality, and so his thought system became the veil behind which the life of the spirit lay hidden. Given a different purpose, however, Freud's systematized description of the dynamics of the ego can serve as a powerful tool to release ourselves from the imprisonment of guilt and fear, the ego's major weapons in the war against God. Moreover, it is fair to say, without Freud, there would not have been A Course in Miracles. Therefore, though not able to help us understand the God we seek, psychology may be extremely helpful in removing the barriers that interfere with our movements towards Him, capital H. It can become an important means that God uses to lead us closer to the ultimate truth about who we really are and who our Creator is. Now, this to me was extremely, very, very, very helpful and interesting. And we can read the footnotes afterwards. But this repressed infantile projections that he's talking about here, you know, I believe that this is the past unhealed guilt that the Course talks about and our attraction to guilt. And, like this really, really opened up some doors for me and looking back at, how we actually, where he talks about here how we're attracted to, he says that through Freud, he says, no one ever strives so hard against something unless one were attracted to it, even if that attraction remained out of our awareness. So it's that unconscious guilt that is what the Course talks about, where he talks about it actually. I'm going to read it verbatim in lesson 170, which came up for me. And he says in the very first paragraph, I'm just going to read the first two paragraphs because I think they are really essential to what he's talking about here. So in lesson 170, there is no cruelty in God and none in me. No one attacks without intent to hurt. This can have no exception. When you think that you attack in self-defense, you mean that to be cruel is protection. You are safe because of cruelty. You mean that you believe to hurt another brings you freedom. And you mean that to attack is to exchange the state in which you are for something better, safer, more secure from dangerous invasion and from fear. That's paragraph 1. Paragraph 2, how thoroughly insane is the idea that to defend from fear is to attack? For here is fear begot and fed with blood to make it grow and swell and rage. And thus is fear protected, not escaped. Today we learn a lesson which can save you more delay and needless misery than you can possibly imagine. It is this: you make what you defend against, and by your own defense against it, it is real and inescapable. Lay down your arms, and only then do you perceive it false. So this kind of blew me away because this whole theory, this repressed infantile conflict that Freud came up with, is looking at not only our projections, it's looking at that past unhealed guilt and how we do make what we defend against, because the defenses just magnify our fear that they were actually made to protect us from. And it made me really think about during my divorce with my husband, how I thought I needed to protect myself from, I thought that I was going to lose everything. So I got a lawyer, because there was a prenup. So I got this lawyer thinking that I would end up getting something that I was entitled to, quote unquote, protecting, so I was defending against my own fear and I ended up losing everything. So you make what you defend against, and by your own defense against it, is it real? I made it real. And the only way I could escape it was to lay down my arms, to let it go, and remember that in my defenselessness, my safety lies. The divorce became a fear-based thought system. I was attracted to the guilt, I was attracted to the fear, and it was this need to protect myself that he's talking about here that was totally out of my awareness, which is just, when I read this, it kind of blew me away that Freud had so much to do with that. There's so much in the Course about this. I'm not going to go into all of it because this could be a whole class, but I mean, it really stems from, that past unhealed guilt and our attraction to guilt and our projections that make our perceptions that are totally untrue and totally what we give over to the Holy Spirit to be corrected for us. So I thought that was really one of the reasons why there would not be a Course in Miracles without Freud. So, yes. And then the very last thing that I wanted to mention here was how he talked about the psychology that Freud brought into it was very helpful in removing the barriers, the psychology, which is the whole introduction to the course, to remove the blocks to love's presence. So I just found that all fascinating. And I see Mickey has her hand up.
Thank you, Karen. Yeah, I love how Ken wrote about this and about Freud and about the ego, and where he wrote, psychology can teach us nothing about the spiritual life, but it can teach us a great deal about our personal self, what we call the quote ego, quote end quote, which interferes with our relationship with God. And I I do believe that guilt does come from that. It's projections from that infantile, what you talked about and what Ken wrote about in here. So also it goes in line with today's lesson 17, if you're following the workbook lessons for January 17th. And on 1:1, it says, this idea, I see no neutral things, is another step in the direction of identifying cause and effect as it really operates in the world. So it also goes in line with the workbook lesson today, which is I see no neutral things. So thank you so much for bringing that up, Karen.
And thank you for bringing the lesson up too, because he also says in there that it's always the thought that comes first, despite the temptation to believe that it is the other way around. And that's what he's talking about here. When you mentioned, it's teaching us about our personal self and how it interferes with our relationship, because we are so likely to project our guilt out there so we don't have to look at it. And the dynamics of the ego that he's talking about here serves as a powerful tool to release ourselves from the imprisonment of guilt and fear, actually by looking at the ego. And that was Ken's big thing, looking at the ego. And he emphasized that in the chapters, like especially the dynamics of the ego, among others, where the psychology part comes in, where the psychologist has us look, to question every value that we hold. So that's how the psychology comes into it, because without looking, it can never be healed. Without looking, we'll continue to project it out and think that it's the outside condition that's causing the pain, So it's just blew me away. And I'm very grateful that we read this part again. Is there anything else anyone would like to share on this?
Gloria wrote something in the chat, Karen.
Okay. And Glorian wrote, let's see. Hi, Glorian. These lessons are about bringing the unconscious motivations to our consciousness. Yes, it's all about the undoing. Yes, it absolutely is. Glorian, thanks you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. It is. And go ahead, Lauren, you have your hand up.
Yeah, good morning, girls. I just wanted to mention also what you're talking about is addressed in concept versus self-concept, and I think it's chapter 31, and that is really laying out for us exactly what the ego is doing. And it talks about putting, these are my words, about putting a mask over what's there and then the projections that we put out there, and that these unconscious, thoughts need to come to the surface so that we can make a change in them. But I just thought I'd mention that it's a concept versus self-concept, and I think it's chapter 31. Thanks.
Thank you, Glorian. Absolutely. Yeah, it's so interesting and it's so helpful.
I just wanted to mention something real quick here too. Gloria and I had talked about this. When Jesus talks in here in the course about the attractions that we have to, and all the different attractions, Gloria and I are wanting to put together something about the law of attraction in accordance with the Course of Miracles. He's talking here about the attractions to guilt, the attraction to fear. We're attracted to these things. Excuse me. And I used to read that and I'd say, I'm not attracted to, fear. I'm not attracted to guilt. But actually, it is. I look for it everywhere. I'm looking for it. I can turn on the TV right now and find, where I'm looking for guilt in other people. Hateful, operations people are doing. I can look and see where I am really attracted. I'm looking for these sinful quote unquote things. But of course, love is attracted to love, and God is attracted to God. So attraction is not just, I want a new car, so I'm going to attract that to myself. Attraction is really what I look for in the things that seem to be happening and give meaning to. And I decide that's what I want to focus on. So that's what I'm going to focus on, these things. So the attraction is not, because, I love, guilt. It is because I love guilt, because I want to see it outside of myself. I want to see where I'm projecting it outside of myself. And so it's, when we're talking about attraction, it's not I'm getting what I want. It's really I'm getting what I don't want. Anyway, uh, enough of that.
Exactly. And that's in lesson 170, how he talks about that, we actually make what we defend against. And by our own defense against it, it is real and inescapable, until we lay down our arms. And only then do you perceive it as false. And it is just all of it. This whole course really comes together. I mean, it's just so synchronistic. You could just feed one lesson off another and one text off another. And um, it is, and it's just so helpful. All of it is so, so helpful. Let's see, there's some more chats in here. Glory, and yes, we have to own the projection. And Mickey says, right, Lynn, we want to see guilt in everyone but ourselves. And that is what the mind wandering is all about. It's all about wandering away from love, wandering away from our source and projecting out that unhealed guilt that we think, is the cause of our upset. And we think it's in that other person when it's only our projection of what we don't want to look about in ourselves. And that was a true learning for me, true learning. And I only learned that through A Course in Miracles. I've been through psychology, I've been through counseling, and I couldn't get it. I just couldn't. I was too busy blaming and I couldn't get past the blame. And so I started studying A Course in Miracles, and that's the truth. Glorian has her hand up.
Yeah, thanks for that, Karen. And I agree wholeheartedly that this course is totally circular. So where Jesus says that those seeking conflict will find it, because again, it's coming from the projection of our own guilt that we're placing out there. But I totally agree with you. I mean, it just one concept leads into the next concept. And I agree with you. The course, the healing force in this course is the responsibility for sight, in that we let go of that victimization consciousness and accept responsibility for these projections. And that's what we were saying before, that where he said in the lesson today, I don't have it right in front of me, but that you are thinking that what you see out there, what something out there is causing you to think and feel the way you do, when actually it's the opposite. And that's the responsibility for sight. And that's I'm not a victim of this world I see. And that's what empowers us, and that's what heals. I agree with you so much. Thanks.
Thank you. I agree with you too. And it's exactly what today's lesson says. Again, I'll repeat it because I think it's vital for me to remember this. It is always the thought that comes first, despite the temptation to believe that it's the other way around. That is projection makes perception. I'm believing that my upset is coming from not my thoughts about it, but from what you're doing, or from what's happening around me, or for what my body's going through. Like this is eye-opening. I mean, this is for me just so that's the miracle. That's the miracle and taking responsibility for what teacher I'm choosing to listen to. So thank you for that, Glorian. And we'll read the footnotes, and then we'll have Michale start with chapter 1, the dynamics of the ego. We're going to get into the juicy juice. So the footnote says that throughout the book, ego, quote unquote, will be used as synonymous with our false self, somewhat similar to Jung's concept of persona and shadow. It thus differs from the conventional psychoanalytical usage, where the ego is but one aspect of the tripartite psyche. In the terminology adopted here, the ego would be roughly equivalent to this psyche, different from our spiritual capital S self, which lies beyond it. And I think that's what we learned in the introduction to psychology about the ego, the superego, and all that Freud's teaching, which really, I think, really prompted Helen to what she called the ego in a little bit of a different way. So thank you for letting me read that, and I'm going to turn it over to Michale, and thank you all for all your comments.
Thank you, Karen. Does anyone else have anything to talk about or share here before we go to reading chapter 1? No? Okay, I'll go ahead and start chapter 1 then. Chapter 1, the dynamics of the ego, the world of guilt, 2 levels. Although psychologists may differ in their understanding of its etiology, dynamics, or descriptive terms, practically all would agree that the central life issue confronting people is the problem of guilt, associated with our experience of ourselves as physical and psychological beings. Guilt may be variously described as self-hatred and self-doubt, a gnawing awareness of inferiority and insecurity, feelings of incompletion, unfulfillment, lack, and a belief in one's personal failure before oneself, others, and God. So would anyone like to comment on this paragraph?
Yeah, I would just throw in there unworthiness, which the Course talks about the unworthiness and how our worth is established by God. And this self-hatred and self-doubt. I mean, I love the way he describes guilt. It is really like a self-hatred, and a self-doubt, a gnawing awareness of inferiority and insecurity, feelings of incompletion, unfulfillment, lack, and a belief in one's personal failure before oneself, others, and God. I mean, that for me boils down to the unworthiness. And then, I always like to remember where he tells us numerous times how our worth is established by God, and the unworthiness is not feeling whole and complete. The unworthiness is not feeling that I am as God created me, and the worthiness is our innocence, is knowing the truth of who we are as God created us, is knowing that that the truth of who we are is unchanging, regardless of what our physical experience is here. So I just absolutely love, I've heard Ken talk about this before with the self-hatred. And I just think it's that helps us to look at that hatred that none of us really want to look at. So that's the looking. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. And that Glorian said beautifully expressed and in the chat. And yeah, I like where he really brought in the word self-hatred, because within this illusionary world, I mean, that is so much all the commercials and the models and the youth it's all programmed towards a self-hatred and a self-hatred of this illusionary self. And then people even go into self-mutilation. So I'm not going to go into talking about that, but thank you so much for sharing that. So uh, I see Gloria's hand up, so please go ahead, Gloria.
Yeah, that was perfect, Mickey. The idea that the self-hatred is our own projected fear and guilt, which is our attack on God. So that's why we perpetuate it, because we have this fear of accepting what we are and accepting the experience of God, that it would annihilate the ego, and indeed it would. So that's why we continuously project this fear out there on the world to make us right. And that's what he says. Do I want to be right, or do I want to be happy? And we know that we'll only be happy in the surrender of that false thought system. And that's it. There's no, making, it's like the idea, leave your nets. And, when you're collecting in the nets, the fish and more fish and bigger fish and tastier fish, the idea is to empty that net and accept and move into leave your nets, he tells us, which is that total reliance on not person, place, thing, or condition, but the eternal spirit of God that I am. So thanks, girls.
Thank you, Gloria, and thank you for that wonderful sharing. And I see Karen's hand up, so please go ahead, Karen.
Thank you, Gloria. And that's an excellent point. You know, how our self-hatred is from our projected guilt and our attack on God, and that's why he tells us that the world was actually made as an attack on God. And it comes from the fear, that we think that we are unworthy, and that's where we don't even, for me, when I think of the unworthiness, I think of, the ego, because I'm not listening to the voice for God. I'm believing what the ego tells me. So I believe I'm separate. It comes down to believing the guilt comes from the belief that I could be separate from God. All guilt stems from that belief that we could be separate from God. It starts there. That's the original, like Glorian said, it's our, it all comes from that. So I think that's really a good point. And I also love what you shared, Mickey, because Michale, because this idealism of perfection here in the world, this has been going on for a long time, but it's more noticeable now that we have the internet, and how everyone wants to be perfect, and all the airbrushing they do on people to make them look perfect. And like I tell my granddaughter, when she thinks there's something wrong with her, something, specifically, she'll point out to me that she actually was thinking about getting it fixed, and I'm like, what? Like, you are perfect and beautiful. She's 20 years old, like, trust me, wait till you get to be 60. Okay. Then you'll start to see things. All right. You're 20 years old. Are you kidding me? And because she sees how perfect these girls, I said, honey, they're not perfect. They're airbrushed. I said, don't believe it. I said, it's all an illusion. So thank you. I mean, really, it's just, it's really affecting these young women today. So it's definitely something that's in this seeming world. So thanks for sharing that, Michale.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Gloria, and for your sharing. And yeah, it's not easy for these young girls, young kids, young boys growing up in this society, because there's a lot of self mutilation, and it comes from all of the standards that the airbrushing and all of that, and this towards perfectionism. And then it goes back to self-hatred, which stems from what Gloria talked about. It's coming from the guilt. That's why, Karen, you brought up the early workbook lessons. It's really I myself am enjoying going back through the early workbook lessons, and I'm going with Ken's book on Journey Through the Workbook, Volume 1, Lessons 1 through 60, and really trying to take it deeper. And so thank you for bringing that up, Karen and Gloria. So I don't see any more hands, so I'll go ahead and read the next paragraph, and then we'll see if anyone would like to share anything on it. Each of us is more than familiar with feeling guilty over things in our past. The history of our individual lives can be seen from this point of view to be a litany to our guilt over what we have done or not done, said or not said, thought or not thought. We feel guilty because we picked on a younger sibling, were caught stealing candy from the neighborhood store, cut school to go fishing or watch a baseball game, or were punished by a teacher for talking in class or not doing homework. As adults, we feel guilty for being unkind to someone in need, having lost our temper, cheating on income taxes, not being faithful to the commandments, failing to perform prescribed religious rituals, or for harboring sexual feelings towards people forbidden by standards of morality. So I love how Ken brings this in, because to me, I'm getting a picture of him as a therapist with all his patients and all those years of within his dream, the history of sitting down with his patients and going over all of their guilt. And so he's bringing this out in this chapter because he's bringing this out from children to adults and their hidden guilt on what they feel guilty about. So would anyone else like to comment on this? Karen, please go ahead.
Yeah, it always reminds me of the part in the course where he says, of all the problems that you think you have, you never thought your guilt was among them, which is like the number one reason why. And this litany, to our guilt over what we have done or not done, said or not said, thought or not thought, I call that the woulda, shoulda, coulda, and when he tells us this, each of us are more than familiar with feeling guilty over things in our past. All right. Now that this really takes me back to religion, because in Catholic school and being raised a Catholic, I went through first through seventh grade in Catholic school, and they really taught you how to feel guilty, basically. They made you feel guilty for everything, and we were children. So, I mean, I say they made you. I mean, no one can make you do anything, but they instilled it in us, and we really didn't know any better. So that belief in guilt, that belief that we were bad, that we were going to be punished, really was strong. Okay. And I carried that throughout, until I started to unlearn and undo those beliefs. But that woulda, shoulda, coulda, the guilt that I felt over my husband's suicide, that is the ego. For me, it was like the ego on steroids. Because when you believe these thoughts, you know, these unworthiness thoughts, these guilty thoughts, these thoughts of wish I would have said this, or if I could have done that, things could be different, which is all bullshit. Okay. But the ego wants you to believe it and keep you mindless, to make you think you do not have a choice to just like the nuns made you think you didn't have a choice. We didn't know any better. We were kids. Now I'm a grown up girl. I can see through, practicing forgiveness and seeing that I do have a choice, that all of it is just a belief that is to be undone. But it took me, because the belief was, and that's what beliefs do to people. Beliefs cause wars, beliefs cause suicides, beliefs cause marriages to break up, all these beliefs in conflict. And, so this is really this guilt and these woulda, coulda, shoulda feelings from the past is coming also from that unhealed guilt that needs to be looked at. And that is what we're learning here through forgiveness. So he also tells us somewhere in the course that lack of forgiveness is actually another term for guilt. It's just not forgiving. It just needs to be forgiven. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. I thank you for that on bringing up the guilt. That was beautiful. And I see Gloria's hand up. So please go ahead, Gloria.
Yeah, thank you for that share. What always comes to me on this is where Jesus tells us in the Course that the old thought system has the basis for return unless every dark cornerstone of guilt is overturned. So we are being asked to look. And for me, it comes through that we look not to be guilty about, but we go gentle on ourselves and we're being honest as these things come up. The honesty, which is what we say and do, is consistent, becomes more real for us. If we don't look, we don't know what we're doing, and it's that unconscious projection that continues to perpetuate. So for me, it's important that we look at that aspect. But I always say there too, we're not, the idea is, and the gift of this course is that we do not have to stay there. We look with gentleness and love, and we have the willingness to see it differently, but we recognize and we're empowered in the fact that we can make another choice. And he tells us, choose once again, brother. So all of these trials presented, he tells us trials are lessons presented once again that where I made a faulty choice, a new one can be made. So if we really recognize that all of this condemnation that we do to ourselves is just our own projection of fear, and that we can be gentle with ourselves, that it's just a mistaken belief that needs to be corrected, not a sin, not anything to be guilty about or continue to feel bad about, but just recognize that this is what the ego, the one ego, does. And the one Spirit of God makes that correction. And it's merely a correction that needs to be made. So wholeheartedly agree that we have to look and really let this unconsciousness come to the unconscious belief system come to the surface, to the consciousness. But I really emphasize that we don't have to stay there. Because, these lessons, when people are doing in the beginning, it's a lot. But the idea is it's not coming up to make you feel bad. It's coming up so you can see it and gently let it go. Thanks.
Thank you, Gloria. And that's so important. And it is a lot on these early workbook lessons. Ken talks about that it'll, it can bring anxiety up. And so I really like where you said you need to be gentle. And in the journey through the workbook that Ken wrote, he talks about in the early workbook lessons in there, he brings up the tortoise, um, the turtle, that you need to be slow and easy, but he wins the race. So slow and easy is slow and gentle. So being gentle on yourself. So, and Ken brought that up, and it's you can see his work also with children, and we're all children, and you can see his work because he like brings this up about the turtle, and so it helps us to visualize it like a child. And that's where Karen had brought up, the infantile, the projection, and the guilt that it's infantile. So yeah, we need to be like the tortoise, the turtle. So thank you so much, Gloria. And I see Karen's hand is up. So please go ahead, Karen.
Yeah, thank you for bringing up the turtle, because for me, that is where Ken talks about this is a process. It's a slow process. It is not something we rush through, because then those dark corners of the mind aren't looked at. That's what Glorian said. That's true as true could be. Those dark corners of the mind that are so unconscious that we don't even realize or recognize, and the only way we can look at them is with that gentleness, with the Holy Spirit. And I will tell you, that is one of the biggest miracles I've learned through practicing true forgiveness, because I didn't know how to be gentle with myself. I learned that through practicing the forgiveness, the course, and through listening to Ken, because he did talk about that a lot, being gentle, being kind to yourself, because I was very hard on myself, because I was very unforgiving. Those woulda, shoulda, couldas kept coming up, and I kept believing them until I could actually stop believing them by being kind, by not judging myself, by being that gentle, loving space that the Holy Spirit brought, through, because it's only with that gentleness that it's going to heal, because we can't judge with the ego, because the ego just is going to keep us saying, yes, but you remember this and you remember that. And, it'll keep bringing up, but it's a, and then, yeah, so yeah, maybe I did do this, I did do that, but then I can look at it with that gentleness and laugh at it, And I know Dove mentions this a lot, but Ken says something, I'm paraphrasing it, but he says, you know that it's been forgiven when you can smile at it, you know, and you can just smile at it. And for me, that's knowing it's been forgiven when I can look at it and say, thank you for that experience. Thank you for that lesson learned. Thanks.
Thanks, Karen, so much for that. And Gloria, and I see your hand up, so please go ahead.
Yeah, just quickly, I so wholeheartedly agree with that because we have to be gentle when we look at this is tremendous because our entire self-concept is being dissolved. So that's the foundation of what we think we are. And that's the last illusion to go is this concept of self, the ego. So gentleness is just so important. Thanks so much, girls.
Thank you, Gloria. And I see in the chat, Karen wrote, all dark corners of my mind need to be looked at, exclamation. One spot of darkness will hide the face of Christ. So true. And Regis wrote, quote, listen to the voice that likes you, exclamation, end point. So we're past our time. So Lynn and Karen, would you like me to finish the last paragraph on on chapter 1 here, or would you like
That would be
to go to
great. I was
prayer?
going to say, Carrie is not here today because his computer broke down.
Okay.
So you could definitely do that if you'd like to.
Okay, thank you, Lynn. I'll read the last paragraph, and then we'll see if anyone would like to share on that, and then we'll go to the gifts of God to end it with a poem prayer from Dr. Schuckerman. So the last paragraph is, the list is endless, yet despite the pain such memories and experience leave in their wake, they are merely the tip of the iceberg. These specific instances for which we feel guilty reflect a much deeper and more generalized experience of unworthiness and inadequacy. Just as the greater bulk of the iceberg lies beneath the surface of the sea, so does this experience of guilt lie beneath the surface line that divides our conscious from our unconscious minds. It is a feeling so deeply rooted that we believe there is no way we could be free of it. For not even God Himself would have the power or desire to redeem us from this permanent burden of guilt. So I really like how Ken brought up that it's merely the tip of the iceberg, and that, it's kind of, you could visualize like the Titanic, and the iceberg was under the water, and they thought they were unsinkable, right? Which is the ego. So it thinks it's unsinkable, but here it comes, the iceberg, and it's there, and it's the guilt, and the Titanic hit it. And so, that's kind of towards ourself on unworthiness and inadequacy that comes up. It's gonna come up. It's gonna be projected out. So I love how Ken, he really gives you a visual, and that's so helpful in undoing the blocks to our awareness and removing the veil. So would anyone else like to comment on this? I see Karen's hand is up, so please go ahead, Karen.
Yeah, that was perfect what you said. I love that analogy. And I love Ken's analogy of the iceberg too, and the visualization. But also for me, and it's kind of what Gloria brought up, what the Course tells us, that it's just a mistake that calls for correction, not a sin that deserves punishment. When he tells us here that, this unworthiness and inadequacy, just as does the experience of guilt lie beneath the surface line that divides our conscious from our unconscious minds. It is a feeling so deeply rooted that we believe there is no way we could be free of it. for not even God himself would have the power to desire to redeem us from the permanent burden of guilt. That is the belief in sin. That is the belief that a sin deserves punishment. So this is what the Course is teaching us, that it is a mistake that calls for correction. And that is so freeing and so beautiful. And that is where we learn that, this is, everything is forgivable. And then we learn that there's absolutely nothing to forgive. When we take those steps, there's specific steps, and then we learn to generalize and we practice the true forgiveness, and we basically accept the atonement for ourselves. So, wow, so beautiful and so grateful and perfect. Thank you for reading that last paragraph.
Oh, thank you, Karen, for that. And yeah, it's unconscious, it's kind and it surfaces. So kind of the visual that Ken gave, and I'm seeing the Titanic. I actually sometimes later on the History Channel, you get to see things, and there actually was you could relate it to the ego. So that ship was supposed to be unsinkable, which is the ego, giving it all power. And they had a structure fire. That's what was on. I believe it was a documentary around the history, and they fixed it, right? They patched it up and fixed it so it could set sail on its merry voyage. Well, unexpectedly, everybody's having a good time, like the ego, everybody's partying and musicians are playing, and it's wonderful. The food is great, you're dining, you're just enjoying your time out there on the sea, and it surfaces. The iceberg is there, and it's projected out. So the guilt is at that point projected out because there was a weakness. There was a weakness in that patch. They just patched it over, and that weakness is what caused. That's what it was on this documentary. I don't know if it's really the truth or not, but that's what the documentary said, is that patching over caused, there was a weakness there in the ship, and it caused it to sink, which is the ego. So thank you. So let's see, we have, and okay, so we love you too, Gloria. And she says, thank you both. I love you. So does anyone else have anything to say before I close with a poem from Dr. Schuckman? No? Okay. Right. Okay, so I'm going to read from The Gifts of God, and it's on page 49, and it's called, Helen's poem is called Prayer for a House. Enter my house. Its holiness is yours, and it must wait for you who are the home of holiness itself. Its altar stands, darkened as yet, but open to the light that you will bring. I have forgot the glow of diamonds and the glittering of gold that once I thought would lighten up the dark and bring me comfort. Silver drapes are gone, and floors are empty of the heavy rugs that once concealed their bareness with designs that Eastern hands had woven carefully in thick obscurity. Their bareness is the sign the guest that was to come is yet not ready to appear and bring the peace that he has promised those who dwell with him. My ringless fingers hold a lamp long since gone out and cold. The wind sings bitterly, a chant of fear that echoes round the walls and enters ceaselessly into my heart. This was supposed to be a temple built to you who said the altar would be lit forever, and I thought that you had said a holy altar cannot be a tomb. Prayer for a House, Dr. Helen Schuckman. Thank you all.
Wow, that was beautiful. Thank you so much. I love Helen's poetry. Ken also wrote poetry. So we're going to be seeing that if we read Ken's biography, which I did go and get. So I have it in Kindle. Anyway, thanks you guys so much. I appreciate it. And I'm going to go ahead and close off this YouTube.